This is Fam Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Tina Davidson. Welcome to the Fam Electric Ghost podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
I'll let people know we are a featured podcast on the Newsly platform. You see the icon up there that says listen on Newsly. If you use coupon code GHOST, you can get 1 month free premium subscription for every listener looking at that. Again, we're a featured podcast on the Newsly platform. And I want to let people know that we're actually at episode 992 of the Fam Electric Ghost podcast today, tracking on Apple Podcast, getting closer to episode 1000. We've got the link to your book, Let Your Heart Be Broken. And that right now is not clickable, but when we are published on all the podcast platforms that you can listen or watch podcast on, you'll be able to click through on that link and actually go to your book on Amazon. And so
Wonderful.
This episode, we're going to talk about Let Your Heart Be Broken, an artist's paths to healing. So again, welcome to the program.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, it's always great to talk to musicians. We started our podcast in 2016 talking to emerging independent songwriters and artists.
Oh, wonderful.
That's how we started. And then we branched
Oh,
out
wonderful.
to all types of people. So you're a composer and you're highly regarded. And you've also written this book. So we maybe want to talk about your background as a musician and then, deciding to write the book and talk about your process as a composer.
Awesome. So I've been a composer for 45 years. I have been a pianist since I was 5. And I write music out of a classical music tradition. That doesn't mean to say that my music sounds like Beethoven or Mozart, but it's that tradition that's sort of being brought forward into our time. I love what I do, and I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a composer. I didn't know what I was going to be. Maybe a poet or a scientist or maybe a ballerina, but I didn't know that women could compose. So of all the many years that I played music before I went to college, so about 15 years, I had no idea that women could write music because I'd never played any music by women. And it really speaks to how important role models are. They offer doors that can be opened. We might not choose that door, but at least it's a door. So when I got to college and they said, well, every musician needs to be a composer and every composer needs to be a musician, I was sort of thrown into that. And after about 3 months of composing, it's really all I wanted to do. And I think I wanted to speak about my life. And when you write music, it's really private. It's really anonymous, especially if there are no words in it. So it was very protective. I could write about this music and people couldn't say, wow, you sound like you've got a problem, or wow, you're really angry, or wow, you have mommy issues. So it was this wonderful, safe place that I could really explore writing music in. So I loved it and just wanted to write and write. So that's sort of how I got started composing music.
That's interesting because I'm a child of the 70s, but I grew up with a lot of the famous singer-songwriters of the era, and there was a lot of women. If you think about Tapestry and Joni Mitchell, and there's a lot of, and with anything like rock and folk music, there were a lot of people.
But in
class,
but
maybe in classical, no.
It's such, I think what's difficult about the classical music field is it pretends to be universal when it's really a male-defined aesthetic.
Yeah.
So Bach, Beethoven, I mean, you just list them. Yeah. But I do think in this century and in the last, women started really coming out and becoming composers. And I think what's important, it's sort of like the men had their half of the whole piece, and now women need to have their half. So diversity is whatever kind of diversity there is. What's important is that there are different views, and our collective wisdom and understanding increases as those views are being heard. And I think that. Go ahead.
Definitely, because if you think about jazz, like a lot of African Americans got into jazz because classical was kind of like closed, just like a closed loop.
Absolutely.
But jazz was able to show that it's just as complicated and just as like vital in some ways. It may be more complicated. So the fact that a lot of African Americans, they think, well, okay, we're kind of being pushed out of here, but then we did the blues, did initial rock, jazz, hip hop, fusion. There's so many areas, and we were able to have our voices heard in areas where we weren't dominant, but then we became dominant because we came out and said, well, we're going to just feel it. And a lot of the music that I'm talking about were kind of from the heart, and you didn't have to go to Berkeley, you didn't have to go to the college. You kind of it was kind of like this. I'm going to feel the ether of the universe, and this. I'm going to do it because I believe I can do it.
Right, and the same amount of practice and experimentation and work goes into all those different genres. So it's not like classical music like says, oh yeah, I work harder, or I had to go to school. I love that Malcolm Goldstein idea that it takes 10,000 hours to make someone really top notch, to start out as in your 20s, that by the time you're 21, 22, 23, you really need to have put in 10,000 hours into the thing that you're doing. And his example is that the Beatles did that. The Beatles, by the time they they put in the work. And I think that we forget that all these great artists have put in the work. And I think, there's no magic bullet in whatever field you are. And that work, I mean, you need to have discipline, talent, perseverance, resilience,
imagination,
and a good sense of humor.
Well, I think a lot of times, what I find is, like, I'm a musician, I'm a keyboardist, I'm a synthesist. So behind me are all my Moogs and my Rolands and all those things. So I build sound design. So not only do I have to know how to play, but I actually build sounds from waveforms.
Right.
So I build my sounds not from patches from what the instrument sounds like. I actually build the sound from the waveform up, with oscillators and things. So I build my own custom sounds. And that's kind of like a painter, like we call it sound painting.
Beautiful, yes.
Because we actually come up with the tone that we're going to use. Before you even write the song, we work on the tone. I work on creating drums, creating kicks, and not grabbing samples, but actually taking waveforms and building my own custom sounds from waveforms and oscillators and filters and all kinds of structures. But that's its own art in itself.
Absolutely.
But it's something like I kind of taught myself, and I've been doing it since I'm 17, and I'm 56. So I put those thousands of hours in to get where I am, and that's kind of where it is. It's just like an athlete, to get the 3-point shot. That's like thousands of hours of practice, to be able to automatically have the muscle memory to play your Stradivarius or play your Yamaha piano or play a Moog. It's like that's because it's muscle memory. So it's just kind of like it's there. And then as an artist, like a lot of us, I think we can channel. When I talk to a lot of artists, they feel like, these songs come to me in a dream, or they come to me when I'm walking in the woods, or if I'm just like, walking down the streets and suddenly I get this idea. And I think a lot of it is a human, like artists are willing to hear what comes to them and take the inner and the outer and actually create something. So you take the ether, you take the muse, and you don't feel like that somebody told you, well, you can't do that, right? When you're an
Exactly.
artist, you feel like you can do that, and there's nobody
Right.
telling you. You don't have that limiting belief that tells you,
Right.
I can't do it because I'm not Chopin, I'm not Beethoven, or I'm not
Mhm.
Lennon and McCartney, or I'm not Curtis Mayfield. So you do it because you believe you can. It's a little bit of, not arrogance, but you have to believe in yourself, right?
Right. For a long time when I was living in Philadelphia, I created a program for inner city schools called Young Composers, and I worked with kids in, I would say, difficult neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods, and their schools were not very well equipped, and they certainly didn't have in the '90s. Um, they didn't have a lot of music, but
Mm-hmm.
I really felt that um, anybody could write music, and this is not always shared by some of my colleagues in the classical music, but I really believe that just like you can paint, you can write music. It's like not a big deal. Somebody
Yeah,
just has to say yes to you. So we did a lot of building instruments from recycled materials because they had cans and shoe boxes, and suddenly cans became drums, and cymbals, and pie pans were cymbals, and
yeah,
then shoe boxes were guitars. And then they had to write music using graphic notation, so they drew the sound, and then they had to create their own notation system. So I really got rid of the classical notation system because I didn't want that to limit them. And what I realized, what I was really teaching, was that we are all born with a creative ability.
yeah,
Many people have been told they don't have it, or they can't use it, or it's not important. And I always wanted to be that person that said, yes, you have two hands, you have two legs, you have creativity. It will grow as you use it. And don't let anyone tell you that you're not creative. That's the basis of life, is to really create ourselves. And I think that was,
well, I think,
to bring,
well, yeah.
go ahead.
Well, like
Uh,
when you talk about, like your title of your book, "Let Your Heart Be Broken," and like I think a lot of artists can take the melancholy, right? They take the
mhm,
painful things. If you listen to Lennon, McCartney, you listen to all the singer songwriters from the '70s, from the '60s, Motown,
mhm,
whatever. You listen to any of the great music. Usually, it comes from a place of like somewhat broken. That your heart
mhm,
is broken, and you write this great piece of work,
mhm.
right? Because to me as a songwriter, it's cathartic to take those feelings and turn them into a piece of work and like a sound
Right.
painting. And I think I think everybody can feel that. And what's interesting today, like you were showing people how to take those, just anything and build an instrument. What kind of freed a lot of people in the inner city is the fact that you might not know how to how to play a piano or a guitar, but if you get a device like an MPC or these DAWs,
Mhm,
these
mhm.
digital audio workstations, suddenly you can have a non-standard controller that has nothing to
Right.
do with the keyboard. It's just pads, and people
Right.
tap out rhythms, and they just
Mhm.
can hum it. And they can, once they
Right.
start playing with these machines, they don't have to know notation. They can
Mhm.
just like I have something in my head, and I try to get my finger to match it, and then suddenly they can do it. And that's how like hip hop and rap and
Right.
EDM and some of these genres are all from people who were not actually piano players or guitar players or bass players or wind players. They don't. I deal with a lot of people like that, and they have no original background in music theory at all. They kind of came from. It's all kind of feel what they feel they want to do. They have something in their heart, and now they have the tools to let them do it.
Right. Well, getting back to my book, because I think you said, and I loved it, um, that it's very cathartic to write music. I would go even a step further and say that is healing to be in the act of creation. First of all, it's something you can control, and many times in life you can't control things. Um, Also, you can speak your truth. So um, when I wrote the book, Let Your Heart Be Broken, I had been suffering from some childhood trauma that was difficult, but I didn't want to just write those cathartic, heartbroken pieces. I wanted to go and find joy and energy and
Hmm.
connection and even things beyond me, like a spiritual sense or a connection to the earth. And I think and I can show you a copy of it.
Okay, there
What
it
I
is.
was writing about was that path for me of allowing the brokenheartedness to be part of my life. So I wasn't always, hiding it or composing about it, but not really integrating it into my life. I
Hmm.
wanted to go through it. I didn't want to pretend it wasn't there. It gave me richness. And so for me to go through it and find other things on the other side was very exciting. That um, almost by embracing your brokenness, there is this rich earth to build
Yeah.
newer things. And you may be many, many times in a place of brokenness. It could be something as simple as your children have grown up and left the house, and you no longer have this identity of being a parent. And that's a huge brokenness for so many people. And it's how you pass through it, with it, live through it, and bring it with you in a healed state so that so you're not tripping over it and falling over it or creating a big mess around it. So that has been really important to me. And I write about that a lot in my book.
So there's like the connection between like your childhood trauma and your composing. It's not a direct like sometimes you have artists that stay like they're in this kind of down tempo, very melancholy, and you kind of say, well, they're kind of writing about their depression, right? But sometimes you can treat it in a different way. If you think about the like a funk genre, it could have been depressed, but then you wrote something like James Brown, and all that James Brown music is not depressed, right? You could have had a lot of adversity, but then you create something that's very exciting and danceable and upbeat. But you could have come from trauma. He had a really traumatic background as a kid, but the kind of music he created was very danceable and uplifting. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a direct connection to what the art you're creating, right?
I think it really depends upon the artist and what their process is. I think one of the things I always wondered is, do you have to be a good person to write really beautiful music? And it's kind of a silly philosophical question, but it's one that I've sort of wondered about. And I do think that being involved in an artistic process where you're so deeply into your own imagination and your own, and you're in your little studio and you're away from life. There were times where I really felt like I had a double life. Like I had the life that
Hmm.
was composing, and then I had the life of being married and having a child, or not, or going through a divorce and being a single parent, or having to earn my living, or all those kinds of things. And I think that having a double life, one of the interesting things is that you can really create yourself completely independently in your art life. You could be another
Yeah,
person in a funny way,
world.
right?
Yeah, you
maybe
build your own world,
maybe
right? Like an author,
yeah,
right?
yes,
Authors
maybe.
like build worlds.
Right. And so I know that this is sort of a silly question to ask, can you be a good person, and do you have to be a good person to write? I do think sometimes my music would lead me to the next question, the next place of growth for me. So I did write a lot about some of the difficult things in my life. I wasn't trying to describe them, I was just thinking about them while I was writing music. Um,
Hmm.
but after a while, my music said to me, well, what about your connection to the bigger thing, to the
Mhm.
landscape, to a bigger thing? And then I started to write about that, and in a kind of a way, I my music suggested that I grow up in a certain kind of way, grow
Yeah, evolve.
bigger.
Yeah, evolve.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
you kind of evolve,
right. So I
right?
think, and that my music also, I pour myself into my music, but my music also teaches me something.
It's a
Maybe it
two-way
teaches me
street. Yeah,
right
it's a
about
two-way street.
myself. Right, it is. It's this kind of interesting process, and definitely um, sometimes being in a composing world, in a music world, in your head, and creating all of this, it's not as gnarly as a relationship between your partner sometimes,
Well,
you
yeah,
know?
because at the end of the day, you control like the environment. Like I've talked to authors,
Yeah.
right, and they're doing character design, doing world building. So if you think
Yes.
about a fiction author or a fantasy author, and I've had them on, like I spend all this time building the world that my
Right.
characters in, I build the character design, and they're totally controlling that, like they're the
Right.
master of that world. And if you think about
Right.
a singer songwriter or a composer, you're writing for all the instruments. You're building that whole world of that song or that piece, right? If it's got multiple movements, you're constructing what that world is going to be. And
Yes.
there's a lot of control. Like when I've talked to a lot of singer songwriters and musicians, we're kind of like control freaks to a certain extent. They have a term because like we can build in my world, I can build all the instruments. Right? I can do the drums, the bass, the guitars,
Mhm.
everything. And not only can I write it, but I can use my synthesizers to replicate it and samplers and all these things. So I can build these environments that even though I'm not a drummer, I can do the drums. Even though I'm not a
Right.
bass player,
Right.
I can do the bass. I can do all the horns. Yeah, I was a wind player, so I have an idea how I should do it.
Mhm.
But but you can just build these whole worlds, and you're not waiting for somebody to show up. You can
Right.
actually do it. And
Right.
so then yeah, I mean that totally is not you don't usually have that much control in your daily life. The things that
You
happen
don't.
and you can't control that, right? So when you're in this kind of creative zone, like in my bedroom studio, I'm controlling all this stuff. But
Mhm.
I go out in real world, I can't control what the next person's going to do, what the weather's going to do, what my boss is going to do, whatever. I can't control. I can deal with it, have strategies, but I think that's what sometimes when I talk to artists is like they like the idea, whether they're a painter or a musician or a photographer of having that kind of control over their art.
Right. Now, sometimes I have to say the notes on the page get a little bit fussy, and I feel like they're like trying to leave, or sometimes there is a section of music that I'm not happy with. I don't love the way it's sounding. Um, and I erase it or I get rid of it or I throw it away. And sort of the next day, there it is again. So I don't have complete control always. Um, but I do think one of the things that I'm really interested in music is when you have a transition from one place to another place. How do you knit that together? How do you create
Hmm.
something where the listener says, wait a minute, I didn't expect to be here, but that's exactly, oh, that makes sense. So
Hmm.
even in the arts, there is a kind of, I wouldn't say science, but a
Yeah,
kind of logic.
yeah, there is.
You
There's
go,
a
oh,
structure. Yeah,
right. You go, wait a minute. Oh, you go, oh, that works. That's okay. I didn't
what
expect that.
transition? Some of like transitions and movements, like you go from
Mhm.
one section, like in the classical pieces, you have these different movements, and
Right.
you could actually change the key, you could
Hmm.
change the timing, the rhythms. In pop music, it's not as that adventurous, unless you look at progressive rock bands like Yes
Hmm.
and Genesis that followed like classical like movement structures, where they could go into different key
Right.
changes and timing changes and polyrhythms, and they actually have movements. If you think of
Right.
like the Who, it's a rock
Right.
opera, so they actually had sections that
Hmm.
followed like this operatic structure, which is
Hmm.
not normal for pop. And so I've
Hmm.
always been more experimental music that tries to do bending, move
Hmm.
one genre into the next, like
Hmm.
jazz with a little classical and rock with a
Mm-hmm.
little punk, or hip hop
Mm-hmm.
with a little jazz, and have transitions where I'm not trying to do what's typical. I'm trying to do more atypical.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah, so it's a different,
That
like
makes
you're
sense.
thinking about music like a novel, like music
Right.
could be a movie. It's very cinematic. Like you think
I
about
think
guys who
so.
do soundtracks. Like a lot of times I've been working on some video game soundtracks, and it has a lot of movement. We actually watch the games like film, and we score to the game
Mm-hmm.
like it's a film. And so we get a
Mm-hmm.
video.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually composing for the sections of the games and doing the
Mm-hmm.
tension and doing whatever the character is doing. We're trying to build it like a movie.
Yeah. 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 Oh, very cool. Yeah. So, what else can we talk about in my book? Um, I've talked about the building instruments and going in and teaching. Um, so I lived in Philadelphia sort of during the 25 years of this book. Um, One of the interesting things that I do in it is that I would write a lot in my journal. So part of my artistic process is to read, so really to feed myself, feed my music. So
Mm-hmm.
read and always journal. I actually do a lot of drawing as well. Sometimes the hand can get at things uh, in a way that, my brain is almost too intellectual. Um,
Oh,
sometimes too much in my head, and so
so
that
you kind of
drawing it
storyboard it
really
out. You
really helps.
storyboard it
So
out, or
right,
paint it out, or
yeah.
draw it out.
Sometimes I just let the hand go, and it just composes, and I mean, it just draws, and that informs me sort of where I am. Um, um, and Go ahead.
Is that like a stream of consciousness? Because I talk to some people who are really into stream of consciousness, kind of in the moment, flow state creativity. And I've talked to graphic artists that get into this thing where I'm just gonna go and free form just do it on the page and see what comes. And I've talked to like authors who say, yeah, I have a plot line, I have the world building, but then I just go at the typewriter and I just go into a flow state and just go. So is it kind of like
Yeah.
this flow state kind of thing?
So the way I start to write music is, first of all, I have a title. I almost always have a title. And then I might do drawings about that title. So right now, I'm thinking of writing a piece, and the title, usually I have lots of titles floating around. Would be called, let's say, Above Ground. I have another piece
Mm-hmm.
that I want to write, which is called How Fast Is You're Alive?
Oh,
And
wow. That's interesting.
yeah, yeah. So with Above Ground, I'm thinking of sounds, that darker sounds and coming out. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I love really dark, low sounds. And I love rhythms, sort of, uh, I think jazzy rhythms, or
Mm-hmm.
uh, really perky rhythms that are always changing and morphing, because that's kind of the way I feel my own energy. My
Mm-hmm.
energy, it's not a line. It's not like going, going, going. It's like, it's like dipping, and then I'm resting, and then I'm
Oh,
doing
like a like
something. And I
like a
love,
bebop.
yeah, and I love the moment um, when you arrive someplace, and just at the moment as your feet are touching the train station, you're off again to another place. So there's that moment of, like, the gravity is pulling you down, and you're almost
Mm-hmm.
connecting to, you're just touching the ground, and then you're off again into something. Sometimes I think of it like rhythm, like a stream, and you're in a kayak, and you're going down this fast
Yeah.
stream, and then you bump into a rock, and you go shooting off this way, and then you so you're not always in control of the direction. Sometimes you'll hit things
Yeah.
and deflect, and I'm really interested musically what happens when you hit that object and you deflect and keep on moving. I happen to love melodies, And I'm always trying to see, because I don't write a melody that's a certain kind of melody that repeats. I tend to extend my melody all the time. And it grows and it grows. I don't
Just
know.
kind of
It's
becomes thematic. Is it like a thematic? Is it
no,
more
no, I
thematic?
don't.
Like if
No,
you think,
I don't.
no?
That's really classical music. Yeah, classical music is you have a melody and it comes back, and maybe you have little snippets of it, and people, and then you kind of develop that. I tend to think of development in music kind of like a caterpillar that is always changing to the end result. It's never
Mm.
in the cocoon and then becoming a caterpillar again. So the melody of that caterpillar is always an evolving self. And I
It
think
keeps on evolving.
that's where my music is, particularly in terms of melody, that the context may be similar, and you wouldn't say, oh, that's so different than what it was from the beginning. You would say, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
okay. But the sense of that melody always evolving and
There's
into wherever I'm
variations.
going.
There's
Yeah.
continually like very well. It's like I don't know. Sometimes like in experimental music, that's like I don't know. I'm very much into fusion and a lot of experimental music from experimental electronic artists,
Mhm.
like Kraftwerk and people like that. But the tendency in that music sometimes is that you do have evolving things, but maybe they kind of goes in and out, right? So sometimes we can go into dissonance and we can go
Mhm.
off
Mhm.
into a very kind of, you know, not tonal, but dissonant, total dissonance or distorted or something that's a little off the beaten path and then come back. But even when we come back, it's not the exact theme that we came to. So it kind of evolves in just
Mhm.
pieces of something, but it's somewhat familiar, but it's not exact. And so
Right.
that type of music is, it tends to be not the normal formula. It tends to
Yeah.
be kind of like, what
It's a
that
different
artist did.
experience. It's a different
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of experience. Um, yeah. And I think the reason I think I like that is because that's sort of the way I see myself. I see myself
Hmm.
as an evolving self. And that if I've gone through the caterpillar and the cocoon, I, I, I I'm always going towards that butterfly stage. I'm never quite there
So you're
because I
never
don't think,
fully the butterfly.
no,
You
I
you
think that
you keep on.
because I keep on changing, and or maybe I get to the butterfly and then suddenly I'm a slightly different butterfly. I don't know.
But you're never
Um,
done. That's the idea, the kind of idea you're never done, right? Some people want to think that you're done, right? That you're always, well, this is me. But then,
right.
who I was 5 years ago is not who I am now. And it's probably not who I'm
No,
going to be 5 years from now. And even in
no.
the same song, the first 1 minute is not exactly the same as the last 5 minutes unless I keep on cloning it. Like, unless I keep on going into the DAW and cloning it and trying
Right.
to make it perfect, I can make it that way, but I'd
Hmm.
rather actually go and play it.
Right.
And so I'm more of a field-based multi-track artist in a world where there's all these DAWs and all
Hmm.
these people sampling and people using AI. I like to
Mm.
go and
Wow.
manually play the bass line for the whole length of the 5 minute song
Right.
and,
Right.
and actually play it like the way you would if you had to go and actually play the bass for the song, or
Right.
play the piano part. And a lot of people would just cut and snip and make it perfect on their charts. But I like to actually hand play the parts out,
Hmm.
which means there's going to be variations because the human beings involved, and it's not exactly perfect, but the microtonal happy accidents are what makes to me the song.
Well,
That
let's talk a little bit about perfection and art. I love that um, the makers of Oriental rugs would always put in a small flaw in their design. They'd have this beautiful design and it would be perfect, except there was a mistake. And they would say that they did that on purpose because you don't want to insult the gods by pretending you can be perfect. And I
Yeah.
love, I think there is a lot of pressure on people to be as much as really good, and it's not possible. And to sort of think of your design as having a flaw on purpose is kind of a lovely thing, and it really speaks to the fact that even if you're creating really good work, there's a sense of humility, and this is by the grace of God that you're doing this, and also being an artist is a real privilege. And sometimes I think that artists have those conversations, like the art is not feeding people necessarily, although it may be feeding the soul of people, and we need lots of different kinds of food. So yeah.
Well, I think like when you're talking about in your write-up about forgiveness and grieving, spiritual connection, I think a lot of artists can kind of equate. A lot of what we do as artists is we try to bring our spiritualism and our sense of forgiveness and grieving into the pieces of work that we do.
Mm-hmm,
and so maybe you can kind of talk about how you weave that into your process, and how you put that into the book too.
Right. Well, for me in the book, I have a really concrete example of grieving, forgiveness. And I always feel that forgiveness is really not about the person that hurt you, but it's about yourself. So when I started doing forgiveness, I had this dream, and I'm down in the basement, and it's really, the floor is dirt floor, and I'm dragging something really, really heavy around back and forth on the floor of this basement. And I know that the rope is cutting into my shoulder and hurting me. And finally I look back and I realize that it's a great big sack, and it looks so big that it probably has a body in it. And I realize that I'm dragging my stepfather and my relationship to my stepfather around back and forth, and that I really needed to get out of the basement. And however, that dream was so potent and so clear.
Mm-hmm.
It was like this big wake up call, literally a wake up call. Wake up and get out of the basement. It doesn't matter how you do it, but you cannot spend your life with this baggage cutting into you, keeping you down in this horrible space. So I did a lot of forgiveness work. I didn't really believe in it, but I thought I'd give it a try. And while I was walking my dog, who was a large, very muscular dog, and would always be tugging and pulling at me, I was going to say, I forgive you. And I was going to start with myself. And the best part of it was I didn't even have to mean it. I would say, I forgive you, whoever I was forgiving, but I didn't have to mean it. And I think if I had to have meant it, I probably wouldn't have said it.
Yeah.
But so I started out with myself, and I forgave myself, and I forgave my daughter and my friends and my neighbors and my whole circle. And then I finally got to the people, my mother and stepfather. And by that time I was almost screaming at them. And what I noticed was that I could start to be with them and not be so agitated. I could be with my stepfather. I could actually talk to him. If he said something crazy, I could stay in the room. When they gave me a Christmas present, I could say thank you. So what forgiveness gave me was kindness. I could start being kind to them. It didn't restore the relationship. It didn't make it all right. It didn't make what had happened go away. But I didn't have to be so burdened by it. And I think I don't really compose about that, but it gave me so much more room to compose because I wasn't so preoccupied by this,
Caught up by it.
yeah,
Yeah.
by the trauma and the pain and the grieving. I could, and I guess, let your heart be broken. You can walk through it and have more space and be
That's
more
interesting that
creative.
it's interesting that your subconscious in your dream gave you that image of that baggage.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
And it kind of like it tells you, like a lot of people say, you should listen to your body and you listen to your mind in your dreams, because your body and your mind in your dreams usually are telling you something.
Right.
And sometimes
Right.
people go and say, well, they ignore it, right? But it's like, but when you actually listen to your body and you listen to your mind, you listen to your heart, you actually, think about what your dream was saying, and don't just kind of dismiss it and say, well, that's just a dream, right? But you actually put it together and say, hey, I should actually, think about taking actions based on what this is telling me.
Well, and I love the idea that when you dream, you are every part of the dream. So I am myself. I am the rope cutting myself. I am the body in the bag. I am the dirt floor. Not that I totally believe that, but it's just an interesting perspective. And I think that's another thing that artists do really well. They're interested in different perspectives. I never find that. I mean, I do dismiss things or say, "Oh, that's not true," but usually I'm really interested. Like, how do you get to that conclusion? Why do you think that? I'm really interested, and I think dreams, they can mean something, or maybe they don't mean anything.
Yeah.
But I'm always interested in looking at them. I'm just kind of curious. Like, whoa, that
Yeah, I
was a
think
really
it's kind of like that childlike curiosity that some people dismiss as they get older. And what I find is the creative person continues to have that drive to be curious and challenge and not be scared of doing something maybe they don't know how to do. Right.
right.
So a lot of times the difference between a person who is actively creative is the fear of failure is not so high that they don't try something different.
Well, and I think that if you're an artist, you are part scientist, which is to be curious. It's not like our fields have got these, walls in them, and you can't feel like, oh yeah, I use my logic, I use my, sometimes I use my math, and sometimes I use my sort of investigative. Oh, I wonder what that's about. I have to laugh because with this publication of this book, and it's been really doing well, and it's been getting great reviews. I've been doing a lot of social media, which I never did before. And somebody said to me, ugh, that's awful that you have to do that. And I said, well, it's kind of fun. It's kind of, it's kind of fun. I create these little, I have to be careful not to get swept away by it because it's so much fun. I could just be doing that. But it's, another thing that I'm curious about. And don't think that the old composers and musicians didn't have to do their own kind of social media. A composer like Mozart, I bet he went to a lot of parties he did not want to go to. And, he talked to a lot of people.
You got to talk it up. But somehow, back then it was probably like you had to actually press the flesh and talk to people, show up at the party, talk to the newspaper, whatever outlet there is.
Yeah.
You had to connect to somebody.
Right.
And so the idea that you just stay in your temple of art and it's beneath you to promote it, it's like, well, okay, that's the starving artist mindset. It's like, well, I'm just going to be a pure artist and I don't have to worry about promotion. Right. And that's like below me to do that. And I think at some point you have to, as an artist, to get it in the world, you have to do the things that put your work into the world. And so sometimes you have to put that business hat on or the social media hat on, or there's other things, right?
And a lot of times, even if you've gone to the right schools or studied with the right people or played with the right people, you can come up with a situation where the front door is not open for you for whatever reason. Maybe you're just the wrong person there at the wrong time, or maybe there is actually a bias against you in some sort of way. But I always say, okay, so the front door is not open, break in through the back.
Yeah.
Figure out a way, use that Yankee ingenuity to create possibility for yourself in your work and for yourself. So Philip Glass, who is a great composer, the orchestras weren't playing his music. So he created his own band, his own group, and they toured. And then Steve Reich did the same. So again, the doors are not going to be open for you necessarily as an artist or even as a person. And so I'm always saying, break in. As I get older, people say to me, well, when you get older, people just ignore you, because you're older. And I said, well, wave your hands, get their attention. Don't accept. And I think that this is a very sort of important thing for artists to know and for people to know. You have the creativity, you have the power. If they're not noticing you, make some, stand there and, make a motion until they do.
Yeah, well, that's why you get guys that go out and they play in the subway. You get people
exactly.
They go out and they show up at an open mic. As
Absolutely.
a poet, like you go to a poetry slam and you show up at the poetry slam, you show up at the the talent shows. That's how, back at a child in the 70s, that's what I did. I went to the poetry slams. I went to in Northampton, Mass. I would go around Smith College and all that and go to poetry slams and read my poetry out. And then then I was able to start doing some music for a play that from a Mount Holyoke College. Lady was working on a play and I did the music for it. Right. So if you put yourself out there, it's because I put myself at the poetry slam. Right. So I sit there writing my poetry, my book in my room, but I had to actually go out the house and walk into the place
I think
to do it.
And it sometimes that's very hard depending upon the person. Maybe they don't have as good social abilities. But I think, again, if you're creative, you're worth that extra effort. Do yourself a favor and really get out there and beat your drum, sing your songs, make some good noise, so you can connect with. Because art to me is always, in the end, not so much about me and my journey or my music, but when it's played, how it affects the listener. It's always this collaboration. I can't do it without listeners. It doesn't exist unless people are there listening to it. So that relationship is very important to me.
I think it's also very important, that everybody's voice can be heard. And there are people in the industry, in entertainment, that try to say it's a young person's game. So they look at my age at 56 and say, "Oh, you're too old," right? They look at people, but that's not true, because I talk to countless people, that are not just 20 something, right? And they're doing very well, right? There's people, multiple age groups. It really is up to you as a person. Like if you put that limiting belief and you tell yourself, "Well, no ways," then it's going to be so. But if you actually show up and you're present, and you start to say, well, if I believe in myself, it's like the law of attraction. If you don't believe in yourself, then you're probably not going to get a crowd around you paying attention to you. But if you believe in yourself, it's not arrogance to believe in yourself.
No.
It's showing that you have, passion. And
people it's respectful. It's respectful to yourself to believe in yourself. And I think if you have a goal in mind that's material, like when I get a certain car or a certain house, or I make a certain kind of money, those are kind of false road signs. And I think that if the sign is when I'm really connecting with people, when I'm really speaking my truth, is music a young people's game? Yeah, it is. but they're going to get old too. At some point, it's going to happen to us all. And I do think I get a sense from my daughters that they're much more interested in what older women are saying than certainly I was. They're interested in the wisdom, the shared wisdom. And I think as we become a more integrated, respectful society that is open to multicultural, non-binary, all those kinds of things, I think that the ageism, I always say that ageism is the belief in the flat earth, that when you're walking along in your life, when you get to be a certain age, it's a flat earth, so you just fall off. And what we really want is a round earth where the old and the young are in connection. And that,
it's like
that
that,
is, right. It's the best.
It's a community.
It's the best
if you think about the community, I mean, if you think about the village and the community and the old kind of school of human behavior, or the oral history, right, before there were books, who was giving that oral history? Well, a lot of women were relaying these stories over millennia for all the ancient peoples. They were retelling these stories through oral histories, and there was like respect for elders. And I think people are starting to realize with these tools like podcasting, their oral communication and oral histories that we kind of give through these podcasts, talking to all kinds of people from all over the world, are lessons that are learned. And it's not just, the fact that if you can talk to somebody like yourself for an hour and learn about Let Your Heart Be Broken, which is your book. I want to let people go and check that out on Amazon. But the conversation we have, that is open to everybody. And so it gets out in this virtual square, and everybody gets paid attention to regardless, because it's like, I think it's very important just to use your ears and listen to the knowledge that people have without preconception, and just figure out what you can learn from that today.
There's a lot of use out there. So I know we're sort of getting to the end of the hour, but I wanted to end on an experience that I had as a young composer that was not a very good experience. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and the professor, I had brought in a piece, a very long piece, and he was looking at it and he was turning pages. It was a big class of composers, and he didn't say anything. And finally he shut the score and he said, "Many are called, but few are chosen." And I thought, whoa, I am not coming back to this class if that's what you're saying. But later in life, I read this other author, and he said, "Many are called and few choose to listen." So what I'd want to say to your audience is, you probably have been called, but maybe you feel like, who's calling me? But just listen and accept the call, because you are your own best advocate and best person to support you through whatever you want to do, so that many are called and few listen to the call. I love that. I think that's just wonderful.
Well, I want to thank you for being on the Family Electric Ghost podcast. I think that's a great point of view to get across to people, because I'm always pushing, people. I think all humans have creative capability. Exactly. And I think it's not just for the few. I think everybody should get into it and just be happy with what they can do. And I really respect what you're doing, and I'm glad that you wrote the book, and I hope people check it out. And thank you for being on the show tonight. This will be out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
That podcast are on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.